What's going on, everybody? Today we're going to be building the venerable Tamiya P-38. I've wanted to do an olive drab World War II fighter for a while now, and I finally feel like my skills are to the point where I can build something decent in that scheme, so let's see what I can do today. Naturally, we're getting started in the cockpit. It's a really nice, detailed cockpit for a 148th World War II fighter. There's a lot of little, knickknacks and doodads in there, and it gives this, the details are really impressive. I really enjoyed working on this cockpit. I, of course, did my MRP interior green over the Tamiya LP11, some hairspray, and did a little bit of post shading by creating a highlight color via adding zinc chromate to the interior green. It's subtle, but I think it gives a good effect. After that, I of course went to the chipping. You may need something stronger than a brush to get started chipping lacquers. Just keep that in mind. I often do an airbrush needle. But after the chipping was done, picking out the details with my Vallejo acrylics per usual, and wrapping those in with a flat coat to unify the surface. As far as weathering the interior went, I decided, you know what, let's do the typical oil wash, but then throw in some pigments. Pigments are kind of an underrated weathering technique, honestly, and in something like an aircraft cockpit that's probably dirtier than we give it credit for, it lends a cool, very 3D, realistic feel. So don't sleep on pigments. See if there's some unique places that you can throw them into your builds. You'll see we've got the finished cockpit all wrapped up there. It looks pretty good, and it's time to move on to the other sub-assemblies. This kit has a lot of sub-assemblies that all go together. The second big one you're going to work on after the cockpit is all of the landing gear bays. I kept it simple for these because I just didn't want to spend all the time in the world on them, to be honest. So I did my Tamiya LP11, hit them with some brown panel liner, and then finished up the details like this khaki color canvas finishing piece at the head of the front bay, or I think it's at the back, but I think I achieved the effect I wanted using a little bit of zenithal shading there, and you'll see these are wrapped up and they've got some nice piping and textures in there as well. Got the booms finished up, so it's time to complete construction so that we can go ahead and get this baby covered in primer. The construction's pretty straightforward, but there are several major sub-assemblies with lots of details. It took me about a week of working pretty much full time to get this model to this point. And you'll see I went and I added the neutral gray around the landing gear bays so that I could make my painting process a little simpler later with less masking. Still gonna be masking, but hey, we're doing what we can. Here I'm cutting out the Tamiya pre-made masks for the cockpit canopy. And honestly, they're not pre-cut masks, but I would rather have them than not have them. It takes just a few minutes to cut them out, and the results are pretty good. And then now that those are done, we can go ahead and get moving on the Mr. Surfacer Black. You'll see I've got a little bit of Mr. Surfacer Gray on that left wing, but I just wasn't loving it, and I said, you know what, I'm going to stick to what I'm used to and go with the Mr. Surfacer Black. So I covered her up with the black 1500 there, and we've got that nice satiny Mr. Surfacer finish for our Tamiya LP11 yet again to go on to. Little pro tip, if you use this stuff as much as me, just mix up a little pre-made bottle of it so that it's ready when you need it. That'll save you a lot of time. I covered pretty much the whole model in the silver because I didn't know where I wanted my chipping to be, and I knew that top surface was going to have a lot. But before I moved on and finished that, I said I should figure out the supercharger and exhausts, so I also gave them the LP11 treatment and then went with the all-clad jet exhaust, which is a really nice method for doing exhausts, honestly, of any plane. But don't forget, hit them with that black-brown 50/50. I forgot to film that, and that's what gives them the nice rusty look. But while I'm at it, I take my black-brown 50/50 and start pre-shading the top surface. You'll notice I don't just highlight the panel lines and hatches and such. I like to go through and think of it as almost more of a shading than a shading Of course, I like to think of it more in the idea of like zenithal shading or something like that, where light and shadows, everything is being manipulated. We're not just highlighting panel lines. And of course, you can see as I do that, I like to go through and use the texture templates as well. They're really handy. And after those are done, I went and threw on a little misting of zinc chromate, not because I want a zinc chromate chipping base, but because I really want to get this olive drab color right on the money. And it's not a straight green. There's a lot of depth and complexity, including yellows, browns, rusty reds. And I said the pre-shading is going to have part of that, and then the zinc chromate mist is going to have part of that, and it's already coming together once you see that first coat of olive drab. After I got the first coat of olive drab, I create lighter and darker shades, and once again bring out the texture templates to get that going. As you'll see on the tail, I didn't use the texture templates. I went for some squiggling, which I also did on the bottom, and I'll be honest, that was mostly laziness. But at the same time, I broke out the Silly Putty, which is a cheap, effective masking putty solution. Even though it's a little greasy feeling, it does not leave grease on the model, so I highly recommend Silly Putty. And it's very satisfying to peel it off and see the nice soft lines it leaves. It does take a little bit of cleanup if you're like me and you're a little bit messy, but you see, you pull that off, and the model's starting to come together. It's starting to feel like a P-38 here. So we've got all of our olive drab on, and the chipping up top has commenced. To do the finer chipping, I like to break out either a toothpick or, for super fine chipping, an airbrush needle, which you'll see pop into frame in just a few seconds here. The P-38s had a ton of chipping. This is confirmed via plenty of photographs, so don't be afraid to go hard on the chipping. You could even argue that I went a little too hard, but I really wanted the aesthetic more than the realism, you might even say. And something to note here is how I go over the individual rivets with the toothpick. Lots of people use the silver Prismacolor pencils for this, but to be honest, I find I get great results, or results I'm happy with the toothpick, even though I might try the pencils soon. So we've got the main chipping going on there, we've got the shaded paint, and the airbrush needle comes out just like I said it would for the fine scratches, because aircrafts and machines in general don't just have chips, they have scratches. Paint wear is a multifaceted, multi-dimensional thing, and we shouldn't limit ourselves to the nomenclature of our hobby when we think about it. And honestly, apply that to everything you do. Don't limit yourself to what you're used to doing. Do what you see. Next, decals. I'm not gonna lie, decaling is my least favorite part of model building, but with the right techniques, it gets a little bit easier. So you'll see I'm putting the decals on with some Mr. Mark Softer, because these thick Tamiya decals need a pretty aggressive decal solution. Be careful with this stuff, it's hot, and it's gonna ruin some decals. But for these Tamiya decals, I find it's perfect, and I got a pretty satisfactory finish using that. I will say though, I went and sealed in the decals with a little bit of Mr. MRP, essentially MRP gloss. It's MRP semi-matte that I let settle. And I find doing that is key as far as protecting the decals and uniting the finish before the flat varnish. Because if you have two different types of varnish under and on top of the decal, the clear parts of the decal can show through and look ugly. So keep that in mind. Finally, we're going through and we're adding the exhaust stains with a little bit of a Tamiya deck tan mixture. Use what looks good to you, what looks good with your paint job. Now, my favorite part, weathering. I am an oil paint weathering guy pretty much through and through. I wanted to start by giving the wings a dusty look because I think that's how it would have accumulated, and it just sort of works with the OD I have. So I mixed up some Tamiya buff and some buff and dust oil paints. I like the Abteilung range, and I'm going through and just giving the wings sort of a light covering in that before I come in and I start filling panel lines close to the engine nacelles with some Starship filth. Say what you want about that color. I know most people like it. but it really worked well for the greasy, oily portions of this model, of which there's a lot of, since you have two engines on top of the wing where people are walking around. It got pretty gnarly. Next, I go and add some engine grease because it's a little bit of a glossier oil paint, and that's what gives us the wet look, the literal wet engine grease look. And going through, adding more Starship filth, more engine grease, the interplay between those two developed a look that I was pretty happy with for this portion of the model. I go through, finish up the panel lines and places that I think this dirt accumulation would happen. I went through, stippled a little more around the nacelles. A good way to do that is like you're seeing right now. Take out your stippling brush, which is just your favorite old brush that you've jammed flat, and blend that baby in. The nose, I will say, is a little different though, because I started with the Starship filth and then I moved on to some raw umber for the most part in that area. So keep that in mind. And even more importantly than that though, splatters. To me, splatters are the big secret of weathering, especially in aircraft because you don't see it that much. It really is what gives that, it just gives such a realistic look. You don't think about it, but splatters happen not only from mud and dirt getting kicked up, people walking around, dropping stuff, but if it rains on the model, you're gonna see all these little splatters. So it goes a long way in my opinion. All right. The weathering is getting finished up. I'm applying the last of my oil paints here. If you like this build, a like and subscribe would mean the world to me. Thank you so much.